Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Today I'm bringing you along as I make a small change in my sewing room, which I hope will make a big difference. Now, I try not to make big changes in my sewing room anymore. For the most part, I have everything set up exactly the way I want it, but sometimes there are things that just don't work. And in this case, I am talking about this cutting table here. So this was used when I got it, and one of the support legs that swings out for the leaves that lift up on here is missing the screw at the bottom that is supposed to actually, touch the floor. So for years, what I would do is I just had a stack of cardboard that I had taped together, and I would just push it underneath it. The trouble is that if it was too short, or if it's smushed down over time, it would get too short and then the table would shake every time. And I just kind of got tired of having to put more cardboard under it. So what I ended up doing is having my dad put a wood block underneath it. And it's screwed in there or bolted in there now. And it works. But I'm not sure if we measured incorrectly and it's too long, or if it's just the nature of this type of leg, because it's the gate leg that swings out and it's on carpet, that causes it to not open well now. So in order for me to open this, I now have to tip the entire thing back just to be able to get the leg to swing out. In addition to that, it has wheels and it is supposed to be able to roll, but it's never rolled well, and since putting that block of wood under the one side, it doesn't roll really at all. And so if I need to move this to move it out away from the wall, I have to pick up the whole thing and turn it. And of course, these things can be worked around fairly easily. I generally only use one leaf of the table, so it has two sides that fold out. I usually only need the one, so it's not like I have to move the table very often, and I generally try to keep the side that has the block under it against the wall so that I'm swinging out the other side. But in the end, it still isn't quite working as it's supposed to, and I've always kind of gone back and forth on whether I really need a cutting table. I never had any problem with cutting my fabric out on the floor. In fact, I still do that when I have really large pieces, so it's not a big deal to me. However, since starting a YouTube channel, I have noticed that smaller things like cutting out the bodices and the sleeves and stuff are easier to film if I have them up on something because of just the size of tripods and stuff like that. It's harder to do on the floor. That's where this dresser comes in. So this is right next to the desk that holds my sewing machine. And in theory, the idea behind it was to have a flat surface for pinning pattern pieces together so that I would be able to kind of sew it, turn, pin, turn, sew, and go back and forth without having to necessarily move but so much if I didn't want to, basically to make things more effective. And it's also just a good decent sized flat surface. This width is actually about the width of my cutting table. So I have tried to use it for cutting out bodices and sleeves and stuff in place of the cutting table. The problem that I run into is while the width is good, the depth is not quite enough. And I don't mind having fabrics hang off of the edges of the table while I'm cutting, because obviously a lot of times if I have more than 2 yards, even on the cutting table, things would hang off. And as long as I wasn't working on that part, I was okay with that. The trouble is that the back of it isn't really finished. And so if anything hangs off of this back edge, it kind of catches on the rougher wood back there, and then I can't slide the fabric around when necessary, to adjust it. And especially with fancier fabrics, they would just catch and almost snag on it, which is obviously not ideal. After realizing that the width of the dresser was almost the same as one side of my cutting table, I began wondering if I could extend the depth enough to make this work as a cutting table. So I went ahead and measured my cutting table with one leaf up, and determined that in order to reach the same size with the dresser, I would need to extend it about 18 inches towards the back. And that works with the space. There's enough room to do that and for me to still be able to walk around the table. However, that is too big for me to have as an extension that's like a permanent piece. And the reason for that is this chair, which is actually, I don't know, I haven't done a full sewing room tour, so you probably don't have an idea of where this is, but where I sit for voiceovers is right next to that dresser that I was just showing you. And an 18-inch extension would mean that this chair can't sit here, which isn't a big deal. I would probably move it across the room anyway. However, on those occasions when I am cutting really big pieces of fabric and need to spread it out on the floor, the chair would need to move and it would probably move back over here. So there needs to at least be enough width for the chair to kind of slide back in when needed. So the only thing I could think to do at that point was to do another sort of gate leg table, basically like the cutting table, where only part of it would be out permanently and the rest would fold down and then swing up and have a leg that swings out. And so I asked my dad about making something like that, and he was willing to try and was kind of planning how to do it when I realized something. And that was just that I really didn't need the space to be the same size as my existing cutting table. All I really need is for this to be large enough to hold a yard of fabric that had been folded in half widthwise. So 36 inches, which is basically what the dresser already is, and then around 30 inches deep, because fabric, if you get quilting fabric, is usually about 45 inches wide, and if you get like fashion fabric is usually about 60 inches wide, and so typically it's cut full, with the fabric folded in half by the width. So therefore I only really need the table to be 36 by about 30-ish inches. That brings the extension that I need on the table down to around, I think it was like 12.5 or so inches. And that size will fit in the space and still leave room for the chair to be pushed over when needed. So I was skeptical about this idea until I found this entryway table. And it pretty much met all of the requirements I had, which there were a lot. It is the exact same height as the dresser that it's being pushed up against, which is apparently a very difficult height to find. It's also white, which means it matches, which is mostly just a bonus. The depth is the right amount. It's like 1 inch deeper than I needed, like my minimum, but well under the maximum depth that I could have and still get this chair in here. Once the table was set up, I moved my cutting tools from the current storage that I had over to the new table in one of the drawers, and then I moved the old cutting table out. And the last thing I did was I did get a bigger cutting mat to go on top, both to protect the surface and just because the other one that I had wasn't quite big enough a lot of times for cutting skirts, which tends to be what I do the most of with a rotary cutter. So a bit of an update, I have had the table in the room for about 5 days or so at this point and have already done a project with it as my cutting table as well as my table for pinning and everything, and I am very pleased with how it seems to be working out so far. And thank you for coming along with me as I did this kind of very small change, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.